Today I want to talk about something that Jordan Peterson brought to my attention, and I think it'll give you a better idea of why the nature of politics is the way that it is, specifically with the social justice crowd. So we're all aware that there's a growing intolerance of any ideas that stray from the social justice narrative. Political division is increasing, and I think it's important to understand where all of this social justice crap is coming from and why it's leading us into Soviet-like destruction. And I think by looking at the political subversion methods used in the USSR, we can see that similar tactics are being used today under the banner of social justice. So in this video, I will argue that Soviet-style practices in media, education, politics are evident in modern Western culture and are starting to lead us to a similar state. So Oleg Kalugin and Yuri Bezmenov are two KGB defectors. I believe they left the Soviet Union in the 60s and then the 80s. And they've been really valuable to the US in learning about how exactly this ideological subversion or active measures were used by the USSR on us. And these were actually quite successful, unfortunately. So even though the Soviet Union fell a few decades ago, the subversion methods put in place by people like them have become a cancer for several decades in universities and media. This attempt at expanding communism across the world is almost as old as the USSR itself. The amount of politically active celebrities all preaching a communism-light mentality that we see now is nothing new. These public figures of the 60s became the ideological predecessors to the modern social justice warrior celebrities. And these deceptively benevolent-sounding principles are just as attractive to young people and entertainers as they were throughout the whole Soviet era. Kalugin says active measures in political subversion were the heart and soul of Soviet intelligence. And he defines this by clandestine actions designed on one hand to affect foreign governments, groups, and influential individuals in ways favoring the objectives of Soviet policy, and on the other hand, to weaken the opposition to it. According to Yuri Bezmenov, there are 4 stages of the subversion process, specifically those to subvert the United States. First one is demoralization. The main goal of the first stage is to indoctrinate young people into the ideologies of Marxism and Leninism. And this stage can take a minimum of 15 to 20 years because it's dependent on reaching the youngest generation and allowing the seeds of this philosophy to shape their political identities as they grow up. And as Bezmenov puts it, in other words, Marxist-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism and American patriotism. So, a requirement of the stage is the useful idiots. Bezmenov claims the professors, journalists, actors, political scientists, and others who can shape public opinion are really needed. They've become enlightened, as Bill Nye says, to communist ideals and disseminate them to the public and students. These ideas then become the positions of the intellectuals and supporters of the oppressed, and who wouldn't want to be a part of that? The next stage is destabilization, and it could be argued that we're currently in this stage. This is the part where the ideologies of those from the previous stage start to define the culture and society, dismantling the existing foundations. This goes far deeper than just abandoning religion and traditional families. In the last decade, the debate about social justice and all the other issues under that umbrella are causing a massive shift in the stability of American public thought and discussion. The next stage is insurgency or crisis. Unfortunately, Bezmenov is not alive to give his interpretations on where exactly the United States falls in this process of subversion, but it could also be possible that we may have experienced smaller insurgencies or crises with 9/11, other terrorist attacks, market crashes, and wars, but mainly continue in the same destabilization stage. We may be still awaiting the dreaded big crisis that will finally shift American politics to a completely different realm. The results of the 2016 presidential election caused many to be increasingly disillusioned and skeptical of the government and the way that it works, and its ability to serve the people. This is always one of the most important parts of a revolution. And finally, normalization. This is simply where no matter how horrible the outcomes of this breakdown of society, we will start to become complacent. And as Bezmenov says,
at that stage, the self-appointed rulers of the society don't need any revolution anymore. They don't need any radicalism anymore. So this is the reverse from destabilization. Basically, it is stabilizing the country by force.
And after crisis, with a violent change in power, structure, and economy, you have the period of so-called normalization, and it'll last indefinitely. He states that so-called benevolent dictators will continue to make promises about the communist utopia despite the abysmal living conditions, human rights violations, and economic disasters. So where do we see these active measures taking place in North America and Europe? Well, the communists in America were officially organized in 1919, just 2 years after the Soviet Revolution, And from that point on, the communist public platform was to fight for the oppressed and marginalized by abolishing capitalism, income inequality, more rights for unions, and so-called rights for different social groups. This ideology presents itself as the answer to all human suffering, as it will aim to destroy the foundations of this capitalist society and replace it with a more just and equal system. This is all quite appealing to arrogant students who've been told that they can save the world by being a communist. But the fundamental problem arises when we try to define who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed, with no room for middle ground. So in a minute, I'll look into the Soviet Union's version of identity politics. But just like then, the young communists are also having to decide into which camp everyone falls into. It can't always be that clear. So one of the first points that they attack is religion, because the undermining of religion is vital to establish their own morality. As religion establishes morality and objective truth for its believers, it can not only be a source of intimate identity, but it also unites its followers under an authority that's not the state. For this reason, religion usually isn't encouraged by the Marxists, and if it is, it's only used to further their agenda, because it provides competition to the ideology and its supremacy to the moral guideline. Now, Islam is an interesting case here, because the Marxists seem to be using Islam as a face for the oppressed and the righteous, and the Islamists are using the Marxists as useful idiots, because both of them, the radical Muslims and Marxists, both seek the same goals, the destruction of Western society. But that's a whole other video. So even with all of their benefits, the free speech and civil rights movements in the 60s and 70s were fundamentally Marxist movements. And for these movements to be successful, it had to appeal to the younger generations with help from Marxist professors, actors, activists, and musicians. So young adults were immersed in a pattern of communist thought that went mostly unchallenged in their daily lives. Because I don't want this video to be too long, I won't get into the aspect of undermining trust in law enforcement and the mainstream media being a vital factor, as I'm sure most of you are already aware of Black Lives Matter and the liberal media's goals. So Jordan Peterson has really become the main voice of reason on social media, especially, for his recent stand against political correctness, postmodern and Marxist ideologies in universities, and most importantly, how this affects free speech. To accomplish the postmodern utopia, not only is re-education in the form of gender studies classes, virtue signaling celebrities, and Marxist professors, but it's also with the law. Because the Overton window has shifted so much, Berkeley students are now protesting against free speech. Laws that stem from this idea of hate speech are one of the biggest indicators that freedom of speech is being attacked. The reason for this is because any attempt at dialogue with these social justice warriors is seen as a tactic of the oppressor to negotiate and exert more power over that marginalized group. What Peterson notes as being quite absurd is the confusion of who the oppressed or the oppressors are. If you have to pick a side, you will simply point to anyone being better off than you as evidence of your oppression. This is most notable in history with the Soviet kulaks. These were a group of peasant farmers in the 30s who were slightly more successful than their neighbors. Now just label them oppressors and the whole country is supportive of sending them to the gulag, especially if you can blame them for all of your problems. But as you can imagine, if you kill all the good farmers, this has some consequences. The idea of privilege and patriarchy is just the same ghost of this class guilt. Failures of communism in the USSR should not be seen as this exception or perversion of this ideology. Communism is inherently evil and tyrannical. It's a system that devalues human life and freedom. But despite all of this, I'm optimistic that more young people are waking up to the dangers of communism. And with that, I'll leave you with one of my favorite Peterson clips on the topic. So thanks for watching.
And then when the Marxists say, well, that wasn't real Marxism, what it really means, and I've thought about this for a long time, it's the most arrogant possible statement anyone could ever make. It means, if I would have been in Stalin's position, I would have ushered in the damn utopia instead of the genocidal massacres, because I understand the doctrine of Marxism and everything about me is good. It's like, well, think again, sunshine. You don't understand it. You don't understand it. And you're not that good. And if the power was in your hands, assuming you had the competence, which you don't, you wouldn't have done any better. And even if you had, there would have been someone else waiting right behind you to shoot you the first time you actually tried to do anything good. And that's what happened to all the old guard who ran the damn revolution. Stalin rounded them all up and shot them, along with their families and millions of other people. So even if you do happen to be that avatar of moral purity that you claim implicitly, the probability that you'd get to act out your goodness in relationship to those possessed by your ideology is 0.